He was seconds from sealing a billion-dollar deal when a little girl whispered one word that stopped everything. What she pointed to in the ceiling exposed a betrayal no one else had seen. Adrian Kessler sat at the center of the long, polished boardroom table, his reflection mirrored in the surface of the dark wood. The city's skyline spread out behind glass walls that seemed to stretch to the sky. At 34, he was younger than most of the men watching him, yet every eye was fixed on the pen balanced between his fingers, waiting for the moment that would close a deal worth more than $1 billion. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the ventilation and the faint ticking of a clock that seemed louder with each second. Lena sat to his right, her smile bright and practiced, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve as if guiding him toward the page. She had chosen his tie that morning. A deep blue silk, she said, made him look decisive. The executives across the table shifted in their seats, their tailored suits rustling faintly, their folders stacked neatly before them, their expressions carefully neutral, though Adrian could sense the hunger beneath. They wanted this signature. They needed it. And for months, every meeting and negotiation had built to this single moment. Adrian's pen hovered, his jaw tight, his heart beating harder than he wanted to admit. It should have felt like triumph, yet there was a flicker of unease at the back of his mind, the same whisper he often ignored when surrounded by deals too good to doubt. He adjusted the contract slightly, eyes scanning numbers he already knew by heart, the figures and clauses memorized after endless revisions, and he felt Lena's fingers press more firmly against his arm. "It is time," she whispered, her voice low but certain, her gaze shining as though the future was already theirs. Adrian nodded faintly, lowering the pen toward the paper, the world narrowing to the curve of his signature that would seal everything. And then a sound broke the silence, so small it might have been missed if not for the tension that made every ear sharp. It was a voice, soft and high, carrying across the room from the open doorway. "Wait." Adrian's hand froze. He looked up, his breath caught. Standing there was Clara, his 9-year-old niece, her small frame half hidden behind the heavy door she must have pushed open without anyone noticing. She was supposed to be in the lounge with Josephine, yet her wide eyes were locked on him with urgency, her finger raised toward the ceiling. "There's something blinking up there," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, yet filled with the kind of certainty only children carried when they had been watching closely. The executives turned in confusion, some frowning, others exchanging quick glances, but Adrian felt the floor tilt beneath him. He followed her finger upward, and in the molding above the table he saw it, a faint red dot pulsing inside what should have been nothing more than a smoke detector. The pen slipped from his hand. Clara stood in the doorway like a shadow, her small frame framed by the heavy glass and steel that made the room look more like a fortress than a boardroom. She had been told to wait with Josephine in the lounge, to sit quietly with a book or her sketchpad until the meeting was over. Yet her curiosity had pulled her here. At 9 years old, she already understood that adults said one thing, but meant another, and she had learned to rely on her own eyes more than their promises. Those eyes were wide now, fixed on the ceiling above the polished table, where her uncle sat with his pen, ready to change his future. She raised her hand without hesitation and pointed, her voice carrying clearly though it was soft. "There's something blinking up there." The executives shifted in their seats, glancing upward, their faces moving from annoyance to confusion, none of them seeing what she meant. To them she was just a child, interrupting a moment that should have been sealed with formality, yet Adrian felt his chest tighten. He followed her finger, and though the room's lighting was bright and steady, he saw it, a faint pulse of red tucked behind the molding, a light that did not belong in a simple smoke detector. His heart skipped, and he knew in that instant that Clara had seen something none of his seasoned advisors had noticed. Lena leaned closer to him, her hand squeezing his arm with a practiced calm. "She's mistaken," she whispered, her smile still fixed, but her eyes flashing irritation at the interruption. "It's nothing. Children imagine things." Adrian did not answer, his mind racing through possibilities. through all the times he had dismissed small details as chance. He rose slowly from his chair, his pen forgotten on the table. The silence around him thick as the other men in the room muttered among themselves. Clara did not flinch under the weight of so many eyes. She only kept her finger raised, waiting for him to see what she had already decided was true. He walked toward the corner of the room, the soles of his shoes clicking against the floor, and stood beneath the device. The faint blinking was unmistakable now, a red heartbeat pulsing in the stillness, and when he turned back to Clara, he saw her face light with the satisfaction of being believed. For weeks she had lived in his house like a guest who might be asked to leave, quiet, polite, never certain of her place, but now she had spoken and he had listened. The boardroom felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of what that blinking light meant. Adrian drew a slow breath, nodding once toward the girl who had changed the course of the morning with a single observation. The deal could wait, but the truth above their heads could not. Adrian's hand trembled slightly as his pen hovered above the contract. The weight of $1 billion deal pressing down on him, yet all he could see now was the small red flicker above his head. The boardroom remained silent, though he sensed the shift in the air, the unease spreading through the polished suits gathered around the table. They were restless, their eyes darting between him and the girl at the door, their impatience growing, but he could not bring himself to sign. Clara's voice still echoed in his ears, clear and sure. And though every part of him wanted to dismiss it as childish imagination, the truth glared at him in the form of that pulsing dot. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked on the molding, his chest tightening as his mind raced. Years spent building a company rooted in aerospace security had taught him the signs of surveillance, and nothing about that faint blink resembled the quiet glow of a smoke alarm. This was something else, something invasive, something meant to watch. He felt the blood drain from his face as realization took hold. The idea that his own boardroom, the place he guarded most carefully, had been breached. Lena touched his arm with gentle insistence, her smile fixed, though her eyes revealed sharp irritation. "Adrian," she whispered, "this isn't the time. You are letting a child distract you from history." Her voice tried to soothe, yet it only made the knot in his chest twist tighter. He turned slowly toward Clara, who had not moved from the doorway, her small hand still raised, her gaze steady. She looked at him without fear, as if daring him to admit what he already suspected. The executive shifted again, papers rustling, whispers building at the edges of the silence. They wanted progress. They wanted signatures. But Adrian no longer heard them. He rose from his chair, the pen clattering onto the table with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. His shoes clicked against the floor as he walked to the far wall, standing directly beneath the molding. The blinking was faint, yet deliberate, a rhythm no ordinary device would carry. His chest tightened further, a cold sweat prickling his neck as he imagined the possibilities. The conversations recorded, the plans stolen, the secrets laid bare to unseen eyes. He turned back toward Clara, and for the first time since she had entered his home weeks ago, he saw her not as an uncertain child in need of shelter, but as someone who had just saved him from stepping blindly into disaster. Her face carried no triumph, only quiet certainty, as if she had known he would see it eventually. The executives demanded explanations, their voices rising, but Adrian's thoughts were far away from the contract. The deal could wait. The signatures could wait. Everything could wait, because nothing mattered if his sanctuary was already compromised. The light should not have been there, and its presence meant that everything he trusted might already be broken. Adrian slid the contract back into its leather folder with deliberate care, his fingers steady, though his heart raced beneath his tailored suit, the weight of the moment pressing hard against his chest. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of men who had flown across oceans and carved their calendars into fragments just for this single signature, and he forced a calm smile that did not reach his eyes. "Gentlemen, I will need a moment to review one final detail before proceeding, he said, his voice even, though inside his thoughts spun like blades. The executives shifted uneasily, some leaning toward each other to whisper, others tapping pens or straightening papers, their impatience visible in every restless motion. Months of preparation had been leading to this instant, yet Clara's small voice had pulled the thread that unraveled everything, leaving the air heavy with tension. He rose from his chair, adjusting his jacket with measured ease, as if this interruption were nothing unusual, as if his decision had not been shattered by the discovery of that faint red flicker in the ceiling. Lena's eyes followed him with a mix of surprise and irritation, her lips curving into a reassuring smile for the room even as her hand reached for his sleeve. "Adrian, they are waiting," she murmured, the warmth in her tone sharpened by a trace of warning. He covered her hand briefly, a gesture meant to reassure her and everyone else watching, then slipped free, every step toward the door measured to project calm authority. Clara stood waiting, still half hidden behind the frame, her posture small, yet her eyes steady. And as Adrian passed, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder, guiding her into the corridor. The door closed behind them with a soft thud that felt louder than a gavel, sealing the boardroom murmurs inside. Out in the quiet hallway, the air seemed thinner, as though the walls themselves understood that a billion-dollar decision had just fractured into uncertainty. Adrian exhaled slowly, the mask of composure sliding for a moment, as he let the truth settle. His sanctuary was not secure, his confidence not absolute, and the girl who had lived in his home for such a short time had seen what he had missed. Clara looked up at him, her expression calm, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't mean to make trouble," she said. "I just thought you should know." He studied her, this child who had already lost so much, who had learned to survive by noticing details others ignored, and he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. She had spoken with honesty, and in doing so, had shifted the course of not only a meeting, but perhaps his entire future. Adrian straightened again, pulling the folder tighter under his arm, his calm returning like armor sliding back into place. The deal could wait, the board could wait, the world could wait, because first he needed to understand what that blinking light meant. Adrian closed the heavy door to his office and leaned against it for a moment, gathering his thoughts, the polished surface of his desk staring back at him like an accusation. Clara sat in one of the leather chairs, her feet not quite touching the floor, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were waiting for a teacher to call on her. He moved slowly around the desk and lowered himself into his chair, trying to soften the sharpness of his voice. "Clara, tell me exactly what you saw," he said, steady but urgent. She lifted her shoulders in a slight shrug, her brown eyes calm, without fear, and answered with a simplicity that startled him. "I've seen lights like that before," she said. "In the last foster house, they had one in the hallway, but it wasn't smoke. It watched me." The words sank into the room like stones into water, rippling outward until Adrian felt them settle deep in his chest. She spoke without anger, without hesitation, as though betrayal had long since become ordinary. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and studied her face, searching for signs of exaggeration or misunderstanding, but there were none. Clara's gaze was steady, her voice almost casual, yet the truth behind her words was sharp enough to cut through the walls he had built around himself. "Someone was watching you there?" he asked carefully, unwilling to push but needing to understand. She nodded once, her expression unchanged. "They said it was for safety, but it wasn't. At night I could hear the hum, and when I moved, the light blinked faster. I stopped sleeping in the hallway because I didn't want to be near it." She paused, then added, "When I saw the same kind of blink here, I knew it wasn't right." Adrian sat back in his chair, his mind running in circles. A child who had already lived through too much, had recognized danger before he had, in his own protected space, in the heart of the company he had built on promises of security. The thought made his stomach twist. He had given Clara a room, clothes, and the promise of safety. Yet he had never thought to ask what safety meant to her. To him it was contracts and encrypted systems. To her it was noticing the tiny details that revealed whether an adult could be trusted. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling the weight of responsibility in a way he had not expected. Clara's life had taught her to be observant, to survive by reading signs adults overlooked, and now that instinct had saved him from a mistake that might have cost everything. He looked at her again, this quiet girl who had entered his home, carrying only a suitcase and a silence thicker than walls, and he realized that she had given him more in one whispered warning than all his advisors had in months of planning. Betrayal might have felt normal to her, but to him it was a wound he could not ignore. Adrian stood on the chair he had pulled beneath the molding, his sleeves rolled back, his tie hanging loose against his shirt, as he worked the small screwdriver between the seams of the plastic shell. The false smoke detector came free with a faint click, the weight of it wrung in his hands, too heavy, too deliberate. He carried it to his desk and laid it gently on a pad of paper, then began to dismantle it piece by piece, his breath shallow, his movements steady, though his pulse thundered in his ears. Inside, there was no trace of anything that belonged to fire safety. Instead, he uncovered a compact lens no bigger than a fingernail, a transmitter board, and a memory chip linked to an antenna no one in his company had approved. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing at the configuration, recognizing the signature of high-grade surveillance equipment, the kind sold only through shadow markets and used by operatives who knew how to stay hidden. The tiny red light that Clara had noticed was the only flaw, a faint heartbeat of betrayal overlooked by whoever had installed it. He connected the chip to a reader from his desk drawer, his stomach sinking as code streamed across his monitor in tight, encrypted lines. This was not an amateur's work. The signal had been masked, bouncing through layered channels, designed to evade detection. Adrian's mind raced, mapping possibilities, tracing the paths of trust and doubt. The boardroom was the center of his empire, the place where secrets were spoken and futures were decided, and someone had planted a watching eye at its heart. He thought of the meetings held there, the discussions about new defense contracts, the prototypes still under wraps, the strategic moves that would shift markets. If those conversations had been captured, then whoever listened now held power worth more than money. He sat back, running a hand through his hair, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Who had access? Who had motive? Who had the chance to step into his guarded spaces and leave behind this silent spy? Lena's face flashed in his mind, her sudden interest in choosing art for his office, her easy smile when she insisted the room needed soft touches, her certainty that the framed painting above the shelves would brighten the atmosphere. Miles came next, his longtime partner, always urging faster deals, always managing the flow of staff and security. Adrian hated the doubt that rose in his chest, yet the device lay before him like undeniable proof. He glanced at Clara, who sat quietly on the edge of the chair, her eyes fixed on him, waiting without questions. She had lived through houses where betrayal was ordinary, where safety was only a word, and now her watchfulness had exposed something he had failed to see. He reached for the device again, his resolve hardening. Whoever had placed this here thought him blind, but they had underestimated a child's eyes, and that mistake would cost them dearly. Lena entered the office with the kind of grace that always seemed rehearsed yet never failed to draw attention. Her heels silent on the carpet, her perfume faint but deliberate, her smile soft and meant to soothe. Adrian had just set the dismantled device into his desk drawer when she appeared, her timing too perfect to be coincidence. She leaned lightly against the doorframe, tilting her head as if puzzled by his behavior, her voice calm and measured. "Everyone is wondering why you walked away from the signing," she said, her tone carrying the gentlest hint of reproach, like a teacher correcting a favored student. "They think you are hesitating, and hesitation can look like weakness." Adrian met her gaze and forced a neutral expression, though inside his mind still churned with the images of the hidden camera, the encrypted signals, the violation of a space he thought untouchable. "I needed a moment," he replied evenly, as though nothing had happened. "The contract will still be there tomorrow." She smiled again, but her eyes betrayed a flicker too quick for most to notice, the sharp flash of irritation before the mask returned. "Of course," she said, stepping further into the room, her hand brushing against the back of his chair. "But you know how fragile confidence is in this market. You've worked too hard to risk everything on a pause." Clara sat quietly in the corner, her small figure almost blending with the leather chair, yet her eyes never left Lena. There was no warmth in her stare, only the blunt honesty of a child who had learned that charm often carried danger. Adrian felt the weight of that look, the unspoken warning it carried, though Lena seemed oblivious to it. She reached for his arm, her touch light and affectionate. "I only want what's best for you," she said softly, her lips curving in that familiar smile he had once found irresistible. "For us." Adrian studied her closely, hearing the subtle emphasis, the careful arrangement of words that sounded like love but felt like control. He thought of the device in his drawer, of Clara's certainty, of the way Lena had insisted on brightening his office with a painting she had chosen herself. Doubt pressed hard against his ribs, yet Lena's presence worked like a balm, urging him to believe, to relax, to dismiss the shadows. That was her gift, to soothe while concealing, to guide his thoughts without force. Clara shifted slightly, her voice breaking the silence. "She's lying," she said with the bluntness of someone too young to worry about manners. Lena turned, her smile freezing as her eyes narrowed for the briefest second before softening again. "Children misunderstand," she said smoothly. "They see things that aren't there." Adrian's gaze flicked between them, the child who had saved him once already, and the woman whose smile had begun to feel like a mask. The balance between truth and desire wavered inside him, fragile and dangerous, and he knew that the next choice he made would decide everything. Josephine waited until Lena had swept out of the office, her perfume lingering like a shadow, before she stepped quietly from the hallway into Adrian's study. At 62, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had served the family through every storm. Her apron crisp, her hair pulled back neatly, her dark eyes steady behind thin glasses. She closed the door softly and stood for a moment, hands folded, until Adrian finally looked up from the papers he was pretending to read. His jaw was tight, his thoughts still circling around Lena's perfect smile and Clara's blunt accusation. Josephine cleared her throat gently, her voice low but firm. "Mr. Adrian, may I speak freely?" He nodded, pushing the papers aside. "I have kept silent too long," she continued, her words careful, yet weighted with something heavier. "But the child is not wrong to be uneasy." Adrian straightened in his chair, a knot forming in his chest. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the closed door as though to be certain no one else was near. "I have seen Miss Lena in places she has no reason to be. The library when you were away, the office when she said she was waiting for you, the study early in the morning before anyone else was awake." She took a breath, her eyes never leaving his. "She moves through rooms that should be private, straightening papers that were never crooked, closing drawers she never should have opened." Adrian felt his pulse rise, the weight of her words pressing hard against the suspicions that had been growing since Clara pointed to the ceiling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Josephine's expression softened with regret. "Because I thought perhaps she acted out of nervousness or a desire to be useful. And because you looked happy, sir, happier than I had seen you in years, and I did not wish to take that away." He leaned back, his mind racing through memories he had dismissed as harmless. Lena tidying his desk, while laughing that men never organized well. Lena placing a vase on the cabinet near the safe, saying the room needed color. Lena closing the study door quickly when he entered unexpectedly. Each moment small on its own, yet together forming a pattern that now felt unmistakable. Josephine stepped closer, her voice gentler now. I have worked in this house long enough to know when someone is looking for something. Miss Lena is not clumsy. She leaves everything as she found it, yet I see the signs, the tiny shifts. Only someone who cleans every corner would notice. Clara had watched with the sharp eyes of survival, Josephine with the steady wisdom of years, and both pointed in the same direction. Adrian's chest tightened as he realized that the life he had built so carefully might already be compromised from within. Josephine placed a hand on his desk, her voice steady. "Be cautious, sir. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well." The house was quiet that night, the kind of silence that presses in after long hours of doubt, yet Adrian could not rest. He sat in the study, with the desk lamp casting a narrow pool of light. Papers scattered across the polished wood, his mind heavy with Josephine's warning. When the door creaked softly, he looked up to see Clara, clutching a notebook against her chest. She padded across the carpet in her socks, her face serious, her hair tangled from restless turning in bed. Without asking permission, she climbed into the chair opposite him and opened the notebook, flattening the pages with both hands. What she revealed made his breath catch. It was a map of the house, hand-drawn in pencil and colored faintly with markers, the proportions uneven, but the details sharp. She had marked each room with careful labels in her small writing, but what froze him were the red circles she had added. One above the tall bookshelf in his office, another near the lamp in his bedroom, another inside the kitchen, where a vase of lilies sat on the counter. In the living room, a small dot marked the corner where Lena had insisted on placing an ornate clock. Clara tapped each circle in turn, her voice steady. "These blink too. Not always, just sometimes when the lights are low." I kept track. Adrian leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, staring at the crude lines that nonetheless told a truth he could not deny. Each red mark lined up with moments that had nagged at his memory. The lamp that never seemed to dim correctly, the vase that hummed faintly when moved, the clock that ticked out of rhythm. He had brushed these details aside as quirks, yet Clara had noticed them all, catalogued them, and presented them with the calm of someone who had learned to survive by paying attention. "Clara," he said quietly, "when did you start watching like this?" She shrugged, her pencil rolling between her fingers. "I always watch. In the last places I lived, no one told me things, so I had to figure them out. Where not to stand, when not to talk, what doors stayed locked. Watching keeps you safe." She said it without drama, as if it were simply how life worked. Adrian felt a cold ache in his chest as he studied the map again. A child should not have carried such vigilance, yet it had saved him more than once in the past 2 days. He reached across the desk, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the paper. "You've done something very important," he said, his voice steady but thick with meaning. She met his eyes for the first time, her own gaze searching, waiting to see if he truly meant it. He nodded once, firm. "This changes everything." And in that moment, surrounded by crude lines and red circles, Adrian knew that the truth of his own house had been revealed by the smallest observer within it. Miles Harrington arrived the next morning with his usual brisk stride, his tailored suit pressed sharp, his smile wide and convincing, the kind of smile that had charmed investors and reassured staff for nearly a decade. He carried the air of a man who belonged everywhere, dropping into the chair across from Adrian without waiting to be asked. His words came quickly, smooth and polished, each syllable measured to sound like loyalty. "Adrian, the hesitation yesterday shook them, but we can still close this deal if you sign today. It will show strength, decisiveness, the kind of leadership that built this company from nothing. Delay too long and you risk more than money. You risk credibility." Adrian studied him carefully, weighing each phrase, each gesture, the memory of hidden cameras burning in the back of his mind. Miles leaned forward, lowering his voice in a way that seemed intimate, almost protective. "I've always stood by you, you know that. We built this together. Trust me when I say the best thing you can do is sign and move forward. I'll protect you, no matter what storms come. The words landed with practiced ease, but for the first time Adrian felt them scrape instead of soothe, as though something hollow rang beneath the surface. Clara, sitting quietly in the corner with Josephine, watched the exchange with her usual stillness. Her eyes never left Miles, her gaze sharp, her small hands folded around the edge of her chair. She did not speak until much later, after Miles had left with a firm handshake and another reminder that the company needed a clear decision. The echo of his confidence lingered even after the door closed, yet Clara remained unsettled, her expression thoughtful, her lips pressed in a thin line. Josephine noticed and bent close to ask what troubled her. Clara whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the quiet room. He doesn't blink when he lies, but he did when he said, I'll protect you. Josephine froze, her breath caught at the blunt certainty in the child's words. She looked at Adrian, who was staring into the middle distance, the weight of suspicion pressing heavier by the hour. Clara's whisper had given shape to what his instincts already feared, that Miles's loyalty might not be as unshakable as it seemed. The office felt colder then, the sun casting long lines across the carpet, the silence deeper than before. Josephine placed a steadying hand on Clara's shoulder, her voice calm. You see more than most, little one. We must be careful with what you notice. Adrian met Clara's eyes across the room, and in her gaze he found both innocence and the hard clarity of someone who had learned to read people as a means of survival. Her observation tightened the circle of doubt around him, and he knew that trust, once so simple, had become a fragile thing, balanced on the smallest details that even a child could see. Adrian sat at his desk long after the office had emptied, the city lights glowing beyond the glass wall, while lines of code and network paths crawled across his screen. Each signal from the hidden devices Clara had marked was traced carefully, his hands steady, though his heart pounded harder with every layer he uncovered. These were not random transmissions bouncing through anonymous servers, not the scattered noise of opportunistic hackers, but deliberate channels carved with precision. He followed the trail across borders and firewalls, peeling back encryption like layers of armor, until the destination revealed itself with chilling clarity. Apex Aerospace. The name flashed on his monitor like a verdict, each letter heavy with history. He leaned back, his chair creaking in the silence, memories rising unbidden. Lena's resume had once included a short-term consultancy for Apex, dismissed at the time as irrelevant, a passing project before she moved into media strategy. She had spoken of it lightly, with the charm of someone glossing over an unimportant detail, laughing that it had been nothing more than dull meetings and endless spreadsheets. Adrian had never questioned it. Now the realization struck hard. Those hidden devices scattered through his home and office were not isolated mistakes. They were part of a chain leading directly back to the competitor that stood most to gain from his downfall. Josephine entered quietly, carrying a tray of untouched coffee, her presence calm, but her eyes sharp. He turned the screen toward her, his voice low. It all points to Apex. Every signal, every feed. Someone inside this house gave them the key. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded once. And Miss Lena once worked for them, she said simply, voicing the thought he had been trying to keep buried. Adrian rubbed a hand across his face, the betrayal cutting deeper the more he considered it. Clara appeared at the doorway in her pajamas, her notebook clutched against her chest, her hair rumpled from bed but her eyes clear. She stepped closer, studying the screen with quiet certainty. So she's been sending them everything, she said softly, not as a question but as a fact. Adrian looked at her, this child, who had already seen too much, and felt the weight of truth pressing from every side. If Lena was involved, then the betrayal was double-edged. She had stolen his trust with her smiles and her touches, while Miles, the man who had stood beside him for years, had pressed him to sign with urgency that now seemed poisoned. Apex had been waiting, watching, feeding on every secret. And those closest to him had opened the door. Adrian closed the laptop with deliberate care, the sound loud in the still room. "No more doubts," he said firmly, his voice cold with resolve. "We know who they are, and we know what they want. Now we make sure they regret ever thinking they could take it." Clara nodded, her small hand tightening around her notebook, her eyes steady, as if she understood that the fight had only just begun. The night pressed heavy against the windows of Adrian's office, the city a scatter of lights that felt distant and cold, while Josephine worked methodically at the cabinet drawers that lined one wall. She had carried the keys for years, never needing to explain why she knew where everything was, her memory sharper than any system, her movements precise. Adrian watched as she pulled folder after folder, her hands steady, her glasses sliding down her nose, her eyes scanning with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime in other people's houses, learning what order really meant. Clara sat cross-legged on the rug, with her notebook open, sketching absent circles in the margins, glancing up now and then, her attention drawn to the silence between words. Josephine paused at a ledger, bound in leather, her brows tightening. She flipped through pages, then pulled out a stack of wire transfer records, her finger tapping lines that glared with hidden meaning. "Here," she murmured. Adrian rose from behind the desk and leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching as he followed the path of numbers. Payments, each disguised through shell companies with names designed to blur into obscurity, routed carefully through layers of accounts that would have seemed harmless at a glance. But Josephine's eye, sharpened by years of catching household discrepancies before they became crises, had found the pattern. The money, hundreds of thousands in total, ended always in the same place. An account bearing Lena's name. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach tightening with the weight of it. Lena, with her radiant smile and practiced calm, the woman who had stood beside him in the boardroom, urging him to sign with the ease of someone whose future was bound to his, had been receiving hidden payments. He turned another page, and his throat constricted as he saw the authorization signatures. Miles, his oldest friend, his second in command, the man who had claimed loyalty with every breath. Each transfer bore his approval, his initials scrawled in the margins, his authority opening the doors for betrayal. Josephine looked up at him, her eyes grave but steady. "They have been at this longer than you thought," she said softly. "This is not recent. The first payment was nearly a year ago." Clara set her notebook aside and crawled closer, her small voice carrying more weight than her years. "They planned everything," she said. "That's why she asked me questions about your meetings. That's why he wanted you to hurry." Adrian sank into his chair, the papers trembling slightly in his hands. A double betrayal, woven through money trails and hidden accounts, each number another cut against the trust he had built. He stared at the signatures, at the proof written in ink, and felt the air grow colder. The truth was no longer hidden in blinking lights or whispered suspicions. It sat on the desk before him in black and white, undeniable and final, and it demanded an answer. Clara moved through the hall with the lightness of someone used to being unnoticed, her bare feet soft against the polished floor, her notebook clutched loosely in her hand. She had meant only to fetch a glass of water, the kind of small errand that helped her feel at home, in a house that still sometimes seemed too big, but she froze when she heard Lena's voice. It floated through the half-closed door of the guest room, sharper now without the sweetness she always used around Adrian, each word clipped and certain. Clara leaned closer, holding her breath, her ear nearly pressed to the wood. "Tomorrow, the contract will fall apart," Lena said, her tone cool and professional, the voice of someone delivering a report rather than sharing a hope. "We'll say Adrian hesitated because he had doubts about his own numbers. Miles already has the forged reports ready." A pause followed, then the faint rustle of papers, then a laugh that made Clara's stomach twist. "By the time he realizes, His credibility will be gone. Investors will panic, the board will turn, and will be positioned to step in. Clara's hand tightened around her notebook, her small fingers digging into the cardboard cover. She had heard lies before, in kitchens where foster parents whispered things they never meant her to catch, in hallways where voices turned cruel once doors were closed. But this was different. This was a plan to destroy her uncle, to strip him of the company he had built, to make the world believe he was weak and untrustworthy. She knew she should turn back quietly, pretend she had heard nothing, but something inside her, the same part that had once pointed at the ceiling and refused to stay silent, told her that silence was dangerous now. She slipped away, as carefully as she had come, her small figure vanishing into the darker end of the hall. Josephine was still awake in the kitchen, tidying mugs, her glasses perched low on her nose. Clara tugged at her sleeve, her voice a whisper that trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. "She's lying to someone," she said. "I heard her. She said tomorrow the contract will fall apart. She said Miles has the fake reports." Josephine stilled, her hands tightening around the dish towel, her eyes narrowing with the sharp focus of someone who had been waiting for confirmation of what she already suspected. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. Clara nodded, her eyes wide. She didn't even sound like herself. She sounded like someone else entirely. Josephine guided her to a chair, her hand warm against the girl's shoulder. "You did right to tell me," she said firmly. "This means we are running out of time." Clara leaned into her, her small frame shivering, now that the weight of what she had overheard pressed down. Adrian would need to know, but more than that, he would need to act. The lies were no longer whispers hidden in the dark. They were a story being written against him, and tomorrow that story would become the truth, unless they stopped it. Adrian sat at the long oak table in the library, the weight of betrayal pressing heavy on his shoulders, yet his eyes clear with resolve. Clara perched across from him, her notebook open, her pencil tapping lightly against the page as if she were already mapping out the next move. Josephine stood near the shelves, her hands folded, her presence steady and certain. The fire crackled softly, throwing light across the room, a strange comfort in the middle of looming chaos. Adrian drew in a slow breath, then laid out the plan he had been shaping since Clara's whispered warning the night before. "If they think tomorrow will ruin me," he said, his voice calm, "then we will give them exactly what they want. Only it will not be what they think." He called a number from memory, the line connecting to an ally he trusted from years of working on government contracts, a man who had guided him through security clearances and cyber investigations when his company first began. The voice on the other end was cautious but loyal, agreeing quickly when Adrian explained the situation in clipped detail. They had seen corporate sabotage before, but this one was sharper, crafted with intimacy, designed to break him completely. "I'll set up the channels," the ally said. "You prepare the bait." Adrian ended the call and turned back to the table. Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright. "A decoy," she said softly, as if piecing the puzzle together. He nodded. "Yes. A contract designed to look real, loaded with trackers. When they take it, every move they make will lead us back to them." Josephine's lips curved into a faint smile, pride flickering in her expression. "A trap built from their own hunger," she said. Through the night they worked. Adrian built the document with careful hands, each clause and figure crafted to appear genuine, every line convincing enough to fool even a trained eye. Hidden deep within, however, were strings of code, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking, trackers that would follow the data as soon as it was copied, revealing the path, the servers, the buyers waiting in the dark. Clara sat beside him, pointing out details, reminding him of Lena's sharp eye and Miles's impatience, ensuring nothing looked suspicious. Josephine managed the household with quiet precision, keeping doors locked, keeping distractions away, her calm presence anchoring them all. By dawn, the decoy was finished, printed, signed with a flourish, placed in the same leather folder that had once held the real deal. Adrian looked at it for a long moment, the paper gleaming in the light of the rising sun, then closed the folder with a decisive snap. "They wanted to steal my future," he said, his voice low but steady. "Instead they will hand me theirs." Clara smiled faintly, her pencil finally stilled, and Josephine laid a firm hand on Adrian's shoulder. Together, unlikely allies bound by necessity and trust, they had built a counterplan strong enough to turn betrayal into justice. Dinner was served in the dining room, with its long polished table and soft glow from the chandelier, the kind of setting meant for warmth, yet carrying a tension so sharp it could have cut the silver. Lena moved with practiced elegance, pouring wine into crystal glasses, her smile radiant, her voice smooth as she spoke of tomorrow's meeting, as if it were already a victory sealed. She leaned across the table toward Adrian, her hand brushing lightly against his wrist, her eyes bright with certainty. "To tomorrow," she said, raising her glass with the polished charm of someone used to being admired. "The signing will mark the beginning of everything we dreamed of." Adrian lifted his own glass slowly, his face calm, though his thoughts swirled beneath the surface. Josephine sat at the far end, her expression composed, her hands steady as she cut her food, yet her eyes remained watchful, measuring each move. Clara sat in her place beside Adrian, her fork untouched, her notebook resting on the chair beside her, her gaze fixed entirely on Lena. The child did not blink, her dark eyes unflinching, and when Lena smiled at her, offering a softened sweetness meant to charm, Clara's lips parted with words that dropped into the air like stones in water. "You'll be gone tomorrow," she said simply, her voice steady, carrying no fear, only truth. The air froze. The clink of silver against porcelain ceased. The faint hum of the chandelier seemed louder. Even the city sounds beyond the windows faded into silence. Lena's smile faltered for the briefest second, her eyes narrowing before she caught herself, laughter spilling out in a delicate ripple. "Children say the strangest things," she replied, her tone light, though her hand gripped the stem of her glass too tightly. She glanced at Adrian, her expression painted with amusement, as though inviting him to dismiss the comment with her. Adrian did not laugh. He studied Lena carefully, his face a mask of composure, though inside her reaction tightened every suspicion already burning in his chest. Clara did not look away, her small shoulders squared, her gaze steady, the quiet bravery of someone who had already learned that lies lose power when faced with unflinching truth. Josephine's fork rested silently against her plate as her eyes flicked from Clara to Lena, her sharp intuition catching the subtle tremor in the woman's hand. Lena set her glass down and leaned closer to Adrian, her voice dropping into a softer register, warm yet edged. "She doesn't mean anything by it. She's only a child, and children test boundaries. Tomorrow will prove everything right, you'll see." Clara did not argue. She only folded her hands in her lap and kept watching, the quiet certainty in her expression louder than any words. Adrian felt the weight of her presence beside him, a reminder of how easily truth could pierce performance. He raised his glass finally, but his toast carried no warmth, only resolve. "To tomorrow," he said evenly, though in his heart he knew it would not be her victory. The boardroom was dark at midnight, the long table gleaming faintly under the pale wash of city lights that filtered through the glass walls, the air still except for the quiet hum of electronics hidden in the corners. Adrian sat in the monitoring room downstairs, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the screens that glowed before him. Clara leaned against Josephine, her small face illuminated by shifting images, while agents in plain clothes filled the space with silent vigilance. Every angle of the boardroom was covered, every word soon to be spoken recorded, every movement ready to be used as evidence. The door upstairs opened with a soft click, and Lena slipped inside, her heels soundless against the floor, her beauty stripped of warmth now, her expression sharp and professional. She moved with precision, glancing only once around the room before heading to the cabinet where Adrian had placed the leather folder. Within moments Miles entered, his tie loosened, his features drawn with excitement he did not bother to hide. He clasped her arm quickly, whispering with urgency, "Is it here?" On the monitor, Adrian watched them lean over the folder, Miles flipping it open with greedy hands, his eyes glittering at the rows of numbers and signatures. He could almost feel the hunger in the man who had once stood beside him as a partner. Lena pulled a sleek laptop from her bag, connecting cables with practiced speed, her fingers flying across the keys. Within seconds the contract was being scanned and transmitted, the progress bar glowing blue against her screen. "Straight to Apex," she murmured. "By morning they'll have everything." Miles grinned, his voice low. "By morning Adrian will be finished." Clara pressed closer to Josephine, her small hands gripping tightly at the older woman's sleeve, yet her eyes never wavered from the screen. Adrian kept his face impassive, though every word sliced like a blade. The agents beside him exchanged glances, but said nothing, their focus on the transmission, their hands poised to move at the signal. The trackers Adrian had buried deep in the decoy document lit up across another monitor, mapping the path of the stolen files as they traveled across servers, each hop revealing Apex's hidden network. It was unfolding exactly as planned, the thieves delivering proof of their guilt with every keystroke. Adrian felt a grim satisfaction rise in his chest, tempered by the sting of betrayal. The sight of Lena's careful smile now twisted into cold focus, the sound of Miles's laughter echoing like poison. Upstairs, Lena closed the laptop with a snap. "It's done," she whispered. "Tomorrow, he'll look like a fool." Miles clasped her hand, sealing the moment of triumph they believed was theirs. Downstairs, Adrian leaned forward, his voice steady as he addressed the lead agent. "You have everything you need." The man nodded, already speaking into his radio, his words clipped, his tone sharp. Within minutes the building would be surrounded, the doors locked, the hunters caught in their own trap. Clara's whisper carried into the room, soft but certain. "They're not winning now." Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze still fixed on the screens. "No," he said quietly. "Tonight they lose." Morning sunlight streamed across the glass walls of the boardroom, painting long stripes of gold over the polished table where executives gathered once again, their folders stacked neatly, their pens aligned, their faces expectant. Adrian entered with calm steps, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable, the leather folder tucked under his arm. Lena followed close behind, her smile radiant, her hand brushing against his sleeve in a gesture of support that looked loving to everyone else, but felt to him like a chain. Miles was already seated, his eyes bright, his posture confident, nodding slightly, as if to remind Adrian that the time for hesitation was over. The room quieted when Adrian set the folder on the table. He did not sit. Instead, he reached for the remote resting near the screen, built into the far wall. "Before we finalize anything," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the silence, "there is something you all need to see." A ripple of confusion moved through the room, but no one spoke. He pressed a button, and the wall came alive with images. The recording played in sharp clarity. Lena slipping into the boardroom at midnight, her beauty stripped of charm, her expression focused, her voice cold. Miles entering moments later, his grin wide, his words unmistakable. "By morning, Adrian will be finished." Lena's laugh followed, sharp and confident, the sound echoing around the boardroom now like a cruel ghost. Executives shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the screen and the real faces of Lena and Miles, the betrayal unfolding before them like theater. Adrian did not look at the screen. He watched the executives instead, watching as shock spread across their expressions, as trust curdled into anger, as the truth settled in undeniable detail. He heard Miles's voice again, low and gloating, and saw Lena's careful movements as she transmitted the decoy contract, her fingers swift and precise. The recording ended with Miles's whisper, "Tomorrow he'll look like a fool." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Then Adrian spoke, his tone calm but edged with steel. This is what they planned, this is what they did, and it is what they will answer for. Lena rose suddenly, her voice breaking into a practiced cry, her eyes wet with tears. Adrian, this isn't what it looks like. I was forced, I was threatened. You have to believe me. Miles stood too, his face pale now, his confidence cracking, his words stumbling. This is out of context. These recordings can be manipulated. You know that better than anyone. Adrian lifted a hand, and the door opened. Federal agents entered swiftly, their badges flashing, their movements decisive. The arrests were quiet but firm, Lena's protests fading into silence as her wrists were bound, Miles sagging in defeat as his arms were pulled behind his back. The executives watched, their murmurs sharp, their anger directed at the traitors who had stood among them. Adrian finally sat, the folder still closed, his pen untouched. The deal could wait. Justice had arrived first. Weeks passed, and the house that had once felt like a stage set for betrayal began to breathe again. Its silence no longer heavy but calm, its rooms filled with a new rhythm that carried laughter in unexpected places. Adrian walked through the hallway one morning and paused at the sight of framed drawings lining the walls. Clara's drawings, once crude maps marked with red circles, now displayed proudly as art. A bookshelf here, a vase there, the simple lines of a lamp. But instead of serving as warnings, they spoke of her watchfulness, of the way she had seen what no one else dared to see. He had placed them on the walls himself, each frame a reminder that truth could live in the hand of a child, each image proof that she belonged. The office felt different too, lighter in ways he had not thought possible. The desk that had once carried the weight of suspicion now carried Clara's small clay figures and the neat stacks of Josephine's careful files. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like fragments of memory. For years, Adrian had built walls around himself, with wealth and precision, with contracts and codes, but those walls had cracked the moment Clara had raised her finger to the ceiling. What had begun as a whisper of danger had become the turning point of his life. The day of the adoption hearing arrived, and the courthouse felt colder than he expected. Yet Clara's hand in his steadied him in ways no business deal ever had. She wore a simple dress Josephine had ironed with care, her hair pulled back, her eyes wide but sure. She squeezed his hand once before they stepped into the judge's chamber, a small gesture that carried more weight than the signatures he had spent his life perfecting. The process was quick, a few questions asked, a few papers signed, and then it was final. Clara Monroe, by law and by choice, was his daughter. Josephine stood beside them, her pride quiet but unmistakable, her years of service shifting into something deeper, her loyalty proven not just to the house, but to the people inside it. She had seen the cracks before Adrian had admitted them, and she had stood firm when the ground beneath them shook. Together they had faced deception and unmasked it, not with armies of lawyers, but with courage and clarity. That evening they returned home, the house warmer than he remembered, the fire glowing in the hearth, the table set simply but with care. Clara pinned the adoption certificate to the wall above her drawings and grinned at him with the kind of smile that reached straight through every defense he had ever built. Adrian lifted his glass of water. No toast needed, only words spoken plain. "To us," he said softly. Clara leaned against his side, Josephine at his other shoulder, and he realized that no contract, no fortune, no towering company could equal the truth of this moment. Family, trust, and truth had been chosen, and it was the best deal of his life. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.